Well, thank you for reading, Bob. And it's good to see all of your faces again this morning. I am pleased to say that today we are crossing a significant milestone in our Story of the Bible series. Because, as those who've been doing the daily scripture readings know, we have not just finished a book of the Bible, but an entire section of the Bible. A section that is sometimes called the Pentateuch, or the Torah, or the Law. This is the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And as Sabrina preached a wonderful sermon on Numbers last week, it's only appropriate that I finish up our time by talking about Deuteronomy today. But gotta be honest with you, Deuteronomy is not quite as exciting a book as Numbers, or really any of the previous ones are. I mean, Numbers, for example, is a book that just has a lot of action. There's interesting things happening. The people are marching through the desert. They're encountering all kinds of challenges. God appears down in the form of fire. They're seeing giants. It's just an interesting book to read. By contrast, Deuteronomy is really just a series of speeches, one after another after another. And to make it even more challenging, they don't even really include that much new content. For the most part, Moses is just reviewing the things that we had already read about in the previous books, even going over the laws again in tedious detail that we thought we'd got past in the books of Exodus and Leviticus. But there is one unique feature in the book of Deuteronomy. There is one element that comes out more clearly than just about anywhere else, and it has turned out to be one of the most influential elements in the whole biblical story. And that is this element on blessings and curses. Bob did it well for us. I just want to highlight a few pieces of it again, where we hear Moses saying on behalf of God, "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish." All right, that's a pretty black and white way of framing it, right? And for some people, this is powerful, it's inspiring, it emphasizes the fact that God gives us a free will to choose between good and evil. But as Bob noted already, for many of us, this is kind of a distressing or disturbing thing to read. It feels like religious manipulation, like God is using threats and petty rewards to try to push us into a certain way of behavior. And part of the reason we feel this way might be because of the times in which we live. Unfortunately, we live in a reality in which there are a number of prominent Christians on our TV and radio stations who subscribe to something that we call the prosperity gospel. And they will explicitly say things like, well, you know, if you just join our program, or you sign up for this newsletter, or you give money to our church, then God will reward you by maybe healing you from a disease, or helping you get hired at that job you want, or fixing magically the problems with your relationship. And I want to be clear, God does not operate that way. God does not sit back with our arms folded saying, you know, I need some kind of a quid pro quo. You've got to do something for me before I'm willing to do anything for you. But that still leaves us with the question, okay, so then what are we supposed to do with this text? Because it kind of sounds like God is talking that way here, right? Well, let's take a step back and think about where we are in the story. That's actually the point of this whole series, to be able to put these kinds of passages in the context of the bigger story. And we remember that the events that we were reading about in Numbers aren't actually just a series of interesting events, but they're all leading up to something. In fact, all the way back in Genesis, we heard that the Israelites had this call, that God wanted to bring them into the land of Canaan and to do this holy experiment with them, where they would be this set apart people who would live by a different set of standards, who would worship and share and show justice and mercy in a different kind of way, and that this would bless the rest of the nations of the earth. And getting to the land of Canaan was a key part of that. And so all this time we're building up to that moment, from the time that the people are enslaved in Egypt to the time that they go through the Passover, they receive the law, they're wandering in the wilderness, until finally by the end of the book of Numbers, they're right on the cusp of entering, right? The Jordan River is kind of one of the key dividing lines between the land of Canaan and the outside world. And so they're really right here on the edge of the Jordan River, ready to cross in. And then in Numbers, you get the speeches. And then in Joshua, the book that follows Numbers, finally the people cross over right at the beginning, and you have that climactic move you want. So hang on, what's going on in between? Well, this is a key transition, one of the biggest transitions in the story of Scripture, when they go from Act 2, the calling of the people of God, to Act 3, where they actually begin to live out the holy experiment of being God's people, right? And Deuteronomy is an entire book that wants to pause and give us a moment to take in the significance of this shift. In fact, it's a double significance. Not only are the people going from one phase of their calling to another, but the leader, the person who has been with them from the time of enslavement all the way to this border with the Jordan River, Moses, is about to die. They don't have him with them anymore. They're about to do this on their own. And his speeches are really a kind of rite of passage. It's the final speeches that he gives, the advice that he wants to leave them with before they enter into this new phase. And so it might be helpful for us to kind of think of this kind of in terms of rites of passage that we know about in our time, in our world. One example might be a little bit trivial, but I still think it's helpful, is to think about the moment when teenagers or young adults are allowed to drive, right? This is a big deal. For anybody who has gone through this process, it is a very exciting thing when somebody first hands you the keys and says, okay, you can take the car, right? Its significance is that it lies in a new phase of independence. All of a sudden, you have a freedom to be able to go where you want in a way you never could before when you were dependent on others to drive you around. It also has this significance for the parents or whoever is handing you the keys, knowing that they don't get to be in the car with you anymore, right? They can't really protect you and make sure that the decisions that you're making are good ones. And so this isn't something that we do lightly. It's not just that one day somebody turns 16 and we say, okay, here are the keys, take off. No, we make young adults go through training and education classes and driver's ed. And if you've ever sat through a teenage driver's ed class, it kind of sounds a lot like Deuteronomy, right? There's a lot of really dramatic and vivid and graphic warnings about what is going to happen if you don't do it right. You know, videos about what happens if you're a drunk driver, statistics about how many people die from texting and driving. Very insistent warnings that it's something that you have to take seriously, because in truth, it is a matter of life and death. And so while it's a great privilege and an exciting thing, we want to be sure that people take this seriously for their own good. Likewise, I believe that these warnings and instructions aren't given to try to manipulate people, but they have the same kind of intense and graphic emphasis on them in order to promote the people's good. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 6 comes out and says this. You have texts like this that say, then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, so as to keep us alive, as is now the case. Now, for us, it might not be intuitive to think, okay, when you're talking about these commandments, these aren't all life and death commandments, right? A lot of them are about eating a particular kind of food or wearing particular types of clothing. Even the justice principles, although they might be inspiring, don't always seem to be like a matter of life and death. But I would argue that they are. And that the ancient people had a more intuitive sense of how close they were to life and death. So, for example, the holiness laws, the laws that seem odd to us about what they were and weren't supposed to eat and wear, were designed to protect from all kinds of infections, physical and spiritual infections, which ancient peoples did not differentiate between those two things, because they recognized how deadly it could be if some kind of a virus got into the community and could kill them. Or the justice principles, they weren't just about being compassionate or doing the right thing. We already have testimony way back in Genesis that shows when societies live in unjust ways, that violence takes over and they literally destroy each other. These are principles of life and death. And Moses tries to make that as clear as possible to the people at the end. Now, I've got to admit, there is one factor that makes this analogy between driver's education and Deuteronomy a little bit hard to believe. And that is the fact that not only does Deuteronomy warn that these consequences could come, but sometimes Deuteronomy speaks as though God is bringing them. God is actually creating the punishment. So we have this excerpt here from Deuteronomy chapter 28, which says, if you do not diligently observe all the words of this law that are written in this book, fearing this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will overwhelm you and your offspring with severe and lasting afflictions and grievous and lasting maladies. That's a hard text to read. And I've got to be honest, I don't have an easy or completely satisfying answer to how we can reconcile this kind of language of God bringing these kind of maladies upon people with what we believe about the God revealed in the greater story of the Bible. We're going to wrestle with it this afternoon if any of you want to go in greater depth in our Facing Hard Questions session. But I do think that there are a couple of things that we can think about that might be a little bit more helpful for us. So, for example, one piece that I'd note is that it's not entirely clear to me whether Deuteronomy has in mind that God is actively bringing punishment around people or kind of just allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their disobedience or ignorance of God's guidance, right? Deuteronomy actually goes back and forth. It alternates between using this more active and this more passive language. So if you want an example of kind of a more passive way of framing it, you can think about Deuteronomy chapter 32, where God has just warned that the people, if they continue to disobey, they'll likely be overthrown by foreign armies, pagan armies that will crush and humiliate them. And at the end of this, God speaks like this. Then God will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they took refuge, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their libations? Let them rise up and help you. Let them be your protection. Now, this sounds, and indeed is, a little bit mocking, but the point that it's making is this. If people turn to other gods or other sources, whether they're gods with names, as was the case in the ancient world, or whether they're gods like the gods of money and military strength and political power in our day and age. And they expect that those things are going to protect them. Then sometimes God says, fine, let's see what happens. You're going to have to experience the consequences of your own misplaced faith. Now, for us, this is still somewhat of a difficult thing to reconcile, that God would have this kind of way of speaking or interacting with us. It's just hard for us to think about God punishing at all. But the reality of the matter is that God is insisting in this passage that one way or another, justice will be done, and that she is, in fact, guarantor of justice. This is something that we should not take for granted. It actually surprises me how often people do take this for granted. I know a number of secular friends of mine whom I share many different values with, but I'm somewhat amazed that they have this optimistic view that in the end, good will triumph over evil, that what goes around comes around. There's some kind of principle of karma embedded in the universe, that truth will win out over lies. And I sit back and say, why do you believe that, right? Like there's not a lot of evidence in the world that's going to happen in the long run, right? The only reason that I believe that is because I believe that there is a God who is the guarantor of justice, who says, not only are my commandments as my guidance the best way to live, but I am going to ensure that in the end, the people who follow these principles, the innocent, the righteous, that they are going to be protected and cared for. And alternatively, to use language that I really appreciate from Deuteronomy, that those who are corrupt and harmful and disregard these things will not go unpunished, that they will at some level have to face accountability for their actions. Or else, what does any of it mean? Now, when we go beyond this general principle that yes, God is the guarantor of justice, and we start reading in Genesis what that looks like, Deuteronomy, what that looks like, what kind of consequences or rules God is imposing on people to create this justice. Admittedly, it is confusing. There is a lot of complex dynamics in this passage. God is wrestling with both the issues of treating individuals fairly on the basis of their actions and on the reality that we are part of larger corporate entities. And we, in some sense, have to be responsible not just for our own actions, but for those of a larger society. God is wrestling with all sorts of different pieces of what it means to be an ancient community, one that faces threats and vulnerabilities that are different from those that we don't recognize than ones we are familiar with today. Not to mention the fact that it has not yet been revealed in this part of the story that there will be a judgment after death, one in which the righteous and the unrighteous are separated out. And so admittedly, it's somewhat confusing. But I would say even here, even in the midst of these sometimes paradoxical comments in books like Deuteronomy, the emphasis comes through that ultimately all of this is motivated by God's mercy and God's love. So at the beginning of Genesis 30, before the passage that we read, we found this text starting here in verse 1, which says, "When all these things have happened to you, the blessings and the curses that I have set before you, if you return to the Lord your God, even if you are exiled to the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there will bring you back. For the Lord will take delight in prospering you." God ultimately wants what is good for us. All of these commandments, all of these instructions, all of this guidance is ultimately motivated by God's desire for us to be healthy and happy and whole. But the emphasis that Deuteronomy makes is that this isn't something that just happens naturally. That the way that we are wired to interact is, to a certain extent, self-destructive. That we have to be very intentional about following God's calls to holiness and justice. That we are encouraged very strongly to model ourselves after the specific worship practices that are laid out in books like Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, so that they can train us to be the kind of people who live in the right kind of way. In fact, Jesus perhaps is the one who makes this the most clear in the New Testament, when in the book of John, he says, the thief, meaning the devil, comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. All of these commandments are ultimately driven by a call for life. But to get there, there has to be a choice. And so I want to end with this passage, the last part of the passage that we heard read this morning from Deuteronomy 30, which puts it in pretty stark terms. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying God, and holding fast to God, for that means life to you. May we all have the courage and the wisdom to choose God's way of life.